Good afternoon. I'll continue where Roger finished on EU climate policies. And the key point I want to make today is that the battle over global warming and how to deal with it will not be decided over scientific matters. It will be determined by governments and lawmakers according to national interests, and that is on the basis of economic and political considerations only. If the science doesn't fit anymore, it will be discarded. And if things continue as they do in Europe, then sooner or later governments will come and attend these meetings in order to find some advisors to find a way out of the hole they've dug for themselves. Nowhere can this development be better observed than in Europe, which obviously we all know started much earlier with costly climate policies. In Europe, long-established climate policies face rising opposition from the public and mounting problems amidst intensifying economical turmoil. In Europe, the fight against global warming was originally conceived by strategists as a political instrument that could bind the EU closer together as an attempt to counter widespread public opposition to the EU. The British government suggested to rebrand the European Union as Environmental Union. The idea obviously being that no one really loves the EU, as Roger made clear, but when you can save the planet, everyone will stick together. David Miliband, the former Environment Secretary in Britain and now the Foreign Secretary, told a conference 2 years ago in Brussels, I quote, "The European Union must become the environmental union. It is the issue that can best reconnect Europe with its citizens and rebuild trust in the European institutions," quote. So Labour strategists were convinced that the fight against climate change would provide the EU with a new legitimacy and a sense of purpose. If the science helps and if we can find some scientists that can help us with that, fine, we'll fund them. Today, very little of this rather naive PR campaign remains discernible. Instead, EU climate policy has turned into one of the most divisive issues within the European Union. Rather than fostering cohesion, climate policy issues are beginning to undermine the very fabric of the European Union. In fact, when it comes to climate policy, the EU today is split deeper than perhaps on most other issues. The EU is split between Eastern European member states, increasingly opposed to unilateral targets and mandates, and Western European states still dominated by the green philosophies of the 1960s radicals who are now in charge of environmental ministries in most West European capitals. Europe is split between center-right governments who are becoming increasingly concerned about the economic implications and burden of unilateral actions, and the few center-left governments that are still in existence, not many in European capitals, who are still pushing green policies. And finally, Europe is split between member states that actually still have a manufacturing base and those who have given up on manufacturing altogether and think that rock and roll and computer games will save the day. It's exactly because the Kyoto Protocol is having such a dramatic impact on international trade relations and internal markets, on energy prices and on the diminishing competitiveness of European industries that climate policy is no longer in the hands of environmental ministers. I have to explain that up until about half a year or 8 months ago, most of the decisions and the driving force was dominated by the green bureaucracy in Europe. So the environmental ministers of all the EU member states, they would come together, they would draft all the documents, and then they would drive climate policy. That is no longer the case. They have been basically taking their responsibility is still there, but the power is no longer there. Nowadays, it's finance ministers and prime ministers' offices that actually decide climate policy, because the international and economic implications are far too grave to leave it in the hands of the green ministries. In short, there has been a dramatic transformation of the EU political landscape in the last perhaps 18 months or so, and climate policy is shifting quite significantly on a number of major issues, and I want to name just 5. Number 1, the EU unilateral emissions targets, as mandated by the Kyoto Protocol, has placed such a heavy burden on European industries and national economies that Europe is moving away from a unilateral approach to climate policy. There's now a developing political consensus within EU governments that this guiding principle has to be abandoned, which is why they are trying now desperately to get the US on board, and in particular China and India. It will be very interesting to see what is going to happen if they realize that, well, with the US we don't know yet, but China and India definitely won't join this party. Number 2, there are very deep splits among EU member states about burden sharing. Which country should actually contribute how much to the whole enterprise? This split has led to the emergence for the first time of a very powerful veto-holding group of rebel member states that are basically intent of halting, eventually reversing the whole plank of the policy, mainly Eastern European states, but also countries like Italy and Germany, who have actually something to lose as a result of these policies. The emissions trading scheme faces a serious crisis of credibility as the carbon price has collapsed for the second time in as many years, is unlikely to recover soon. And interestingly, the crisis of the whole scheme is now affecting policies in Australia, in New Zealand, even in the US. People are realizing that it's much more complex than they thought. Finally, the EU is facing isolation, political isolation internationally. There's no bloc with whom to align themselves. China, India are basically recruiting the rest of the world into their camp, the G77 countries. Europe is isolated, and the US will have to decide whether they want the confrontation course with China or whether they want the cooperation with China. They can't have it both ways, and it will be interesting to observe which way the US is going to go. The interesting turning point was in last December, when the EU had to negotiate the so-called climate package, which was diluted beyond recognition. Roger mentioned the 20% emissions cut to 1990 levels. That was originally in the package, and that has been diluted, if you take all the exemptions that have been factored into, about 4%. But they are still selling 20% internationally, and now obviously are demanding that the US also adopts this type of short, medium-term target. The wrangle over Europe's climate strategy and the manifest climb down marked a defining moment in European climate policy. It epitomizes a radical change of priorities, and in a way it symbolizes the end of the so-called green age in Europe. It's likely that the green movement will never again have a dominance on European policy to the extent it has had over the last 20 years. The EU is still pushing for 3 key issues on the international stage. The first is they want binding emission cuts for the developed world. In particular, they are pressing for commitments from the US administration. They've, in their document that they published just a few weeks ago, in their strategy, they want the developed world to commit to emissions reductions of 30% compared to 1990 by 2020. And you may be aware that Obama's climate negotiator has already said that they don't intend to play ball. They don't want anything to do with these short-term targets and have basically told the European to get lost. So the US is not ready at this point to commit to any short-term targets. It will be interesting to see if they commit to any targets. Who knows what's going to happen? My guess is it all depends on the economic crisis. My understanding is that even within the Democratic Party, there are deep concerns about the implications of these policies. Secondly, and more crucially, the European Union is demanding the developing world to commit to legally binding targets. The idea is that developing countries should commit to reductions of 15 to 30% from what is called business as usual emissions. So not a complete 15 to 30% emissions, but a 15 to 30% emissions from business as usual. But whatever the EU wants, both China and India have already categorically ruled out any legally binding targets anyhow. And finally, the EU is desperately looking for about 175 billion euros, which they think will be required every year for transfer to third world countries to adapt to climate change. And funnily enough, they can't find any money. So they've now come up with the idea that, well, given that we haven't got any money, perhaps the industry should come up with about 175 billion euros every year, mainly to transfer to China and India, so that they sign on to a post-Kyoto treaty. I kid you not. The EU is deadlocked. Despite these ideas, in that these policies are highly contentious, even among the member states. And you have to remember, even within the member states themselves, there are deep splits between different ministries. It is very interesting to note that the Italians managed to get a revision clause into the climate change package that was agreed in December, which basically states that the whole climate policy of Europe will be revisited if the Copenhagen Climate Conference in December doesn't come to a global agreement. What the Europeans basically are saying now is that if other blocs and other major emitters are not willing to join in the whole philosophy of binding emission targets, Europe will have to reassess their position, and there will be a growing pressure from member states to water down the whole policy even further to what it has been watered down. The crash of the emission trading scheme that Roger mentioned has undermined the whole credibility of Europe's climate policy. Many companies now in Europe are basically selling the credits because they need cash, not for anything to do with the climate. And the sell-off of credits has obviously led to the crash of the price for credits. So the drop in demand and the recession are likely to depress carbon prices further for many years to come. and the effectiveness of the whole scheme is increasingly questioned. Faced, and that's also important to know, there is growing popular resentment. For the first time in Europe, you see large chunks of popular opinion speaking out against the whole philosophy of climate policy. Skepticism in the public domain is growing, and parties that used to win elections on green issues are, did I say lose? That used to win elections on green issues are beginning to lose elections. So there is a growing realization that the public, partly because of green taxation, partly because of dramatically rising energy prices, and partly because somehow people have started to realize that it isn't warming, if you combine that together, they are not very happy to see these policies being implemented. Let me conclude. The political atmosphere in Europe has changed dramatically in the last couple of years. The deepening economic crisis has demoted green policies near to the bottom of the political agenda. And many European countries are experiencing a political backlash over their costly climate and renewable energy schemes. And above all, Europe's politicians are beginning to realize that climate taxes have turned into political liabilities that may undermine not just the economic stability of their countries, but their chances of re-election. As German radio Deutsche Welle put it recently, with a recession tightening its grip on the German economy, Angela Merkel, who used to be the German Al Gore, is betting that job reassurance is more important to the average worker than being a pioneer in tackling climate change. Perhaps the most critical factor for the growing skepticism in Europe about costly climate policies is the vanishing strength of Europe's center-left and green parties. These used to be among the most forceful climate alarmists, but today Labour and Green parties throughout Europe have lost much of their popularity and support in recent years. And amid growing fears of a deepening recession, there are also signs that within these parties, particularly the Labour Party, there are growing concerns that the green issues are driving their core voters away. So, to cut a long story short, climate change is no longer what it used to be in Europe. The political climate has cooled. People are concerned that Europe is left on its own with a unilateral climate policy that is undermining the competitiveness and the strength of whatever is left of European industry. And if India and China and the US won't join the party, in all likelihood there will be growing pressure for Europe to turn away from policies that have dominated Europe for more than 20 years. Let's hope it won't last as long in the US. Thank you.